So as the editor of my own school newspaper, we still don't know how to do it either. And we're youth writing for youth, and it's all the youth who run it, and we still don't know. And it breaks my heart every time I see Night Watch on the ground, and I just pick it up and I go and cry.
You just have to remember that newspaper is always fish wrap. Or it's on the bottom of a bird cage. You can't take it personally.
And like last year we had like 2 contributors. It was me and Anna, who's our publisher, and this year we have like 4, and the way we got it is by getting them to write what they want. And I was like, anything. I mean, the only page that is actually quote unquote read is like the word search page. So so the only way we got that is people like picking out little talent, like, oh, creative writing, whatever, like we were all saying, poetry, whatnot, and putting it in just to have something to give out, you know? But something that I'd like to say, there's a lot of people, like for example at iLead, which I, like for a first time event, I think it went great, and there was a lot of like positive feedback. But my one thing, and this is in general, not just about the conference, is that when they bring people to talk to youth, but they're not youth. And that bothers me, because I'm like, because you can do it, but don't call it a youth conference, okay? It's not a youth conference.
It should be a conference by parents for youth.
Yeah, and the people I think who benefit from youth things are parents and not youth. So I think the one way to actually get to youth is to get youth to write and youth to talk about it. So I think that's something, and I think you guys are doing that by having me write. Which I haven't seen it published yet, but you know.
Well, because the deadline is like, wow, I did get the book review of a very controversial book.
Yeah.
Yes. Thank you so much. Do we have anyone else who'd like to speak or make a comment?
I'd actually like to say something too.
Perfect.
So what's your name, sister? And the other sister?
Fur.
Actually, it's about what you mentioned, and I think I kind of put it in here. What are some things that I know in the community? And I mean, I wrote for the paper for a while, and so whenever I got a chance, I told people to read the paper, right? And whenever something came up, I said we should, report about it in the paper. And often, and I mean, this happened just last week. I was talking with people at the iLead conference about similar points like that. And I said, oh, it was reported in the Muslim... they're like, no, not the Muslim League. They report stuff we don't like. And I thought that's what we actually have to have in our community. You see, everyone can say, alhamdulillah, we have our responsibilities in our community, the organizations, the leadership, and all this. But if we look at our society as a whole, what really pushed us into that state of accountability is when media made the news get to everybody. And then people were worried and concerned about what they were doing and felt a little more accountable. I know we all believe Allah is watching us when we do things, but unfortunately, subhanAllah, we still see that we're not doing that. We still forget sometimes. But if the newspaper is going to report on it, we're a little more careful. So I think bravo to the paper for doing that, for touching on things. I mean, I remember hearing an article, Sister Sakina wrote about the converts, and I heard people say, oh, Sister Sakina, she wrote that article, shame on her. Or the brothers who wrote about the imam, choosing the imam a couple of years ago. Oh, this shouldn't come out in the paper. This is stuff that, alhamdulillah, and I encourage everyone too, if there's something that you want to talk about, an issue in your community, do bring it to the paper, and don't fear, as Shelby experienced, it'll get published. They need more material too.
Thank you. Any more feedback from the audience?
I took off my moderator hat and I have my just me hat. I actually have a question for Louisa, and it's not directly related to the Muslim Link, but I just can't pass up this opportunity. One thing that as a practicing journalist that I've noticed and that irks me all the time is a lack of diversity in our mainstream media. And I know that for some time when I was at CBC Radio, for example, at one time in the heyday, there was this real effort to reach out into diverse communities. At one point there was funding, when there was a little bit of funding available, where CBC would say, we really need to make sure that we are hearing from all sorts of communities. I've worked in the Citizen a little bit here and there, right after university, and I remember that it wasn't that diverse of a newsroom, but I never heard any of those conversations. They may have been happening. But I'm just wondering now, where we are, 2013, when I'm opening up most of our mainstream press, it's still very, the percentage of diverse writers are still so few and not reflective at all of our population. And I'm not saying that I'm blaming the mainstream media, because I know, for example, for the Muslim community, there are very few Muslims going to journalism school. So I'm not blaming anyone. There's a scholarship actually at Carleton for Muslim women to take journalism and get a scholarship, and that has not been awarded at least for 1 full year or 2 years because no one is applying. So I'm not trying to blame, but I'm just wondering, do those conversations happen anymore in terms of reaching out to the diverse communities, not just covering them, but inviting their writers? Like, would it ever happen that the Ottawa Citizen editorial would look at the Muslim Link newspaper and go, there are some good writers in there, why don't we invite them to write? I know they've got Aisha Shirazi as a guest blogger, but she doesn't have a column, for example. I'm just wondering, are those conversations that ever happen, or are they not happening? And what can we do about it, if anything?
Thank you. Good question. Difficult and unpopular answer. First of all, when you talk about CBC at the beginning, very, very big difference between a broadcast organization and a newspaper. They're held to different standards of reflecting the community. And when you talk about a public broadcaster, which is under a much different obligation, we are owned by a corporation that is the moment doing absolutely everything it can to make us more profitable, to pay down its own debt. So for the here and now, the focus is on survival. Absolutely on getting the paper out every day with a much reduced staff and much reduced budget. And so discussions about how to make us better in the community are almost nil, whatever community you want to talk about. It is all about flat out, to the wall survival every day. Doesn't mean there aren't people who think about it, who want to do a better job at it. It's just the reality it is now. I will say, having worked at the Toronto Star, for example, for 8 years, in some ways I feel like the city and the newspaper in Toronto, like if you take the city of Toronto and the Star, and the city of Ottawa and the Citizen, very similar. Toronto is much further along in its understanding of its own diversities. It's much more diverse. When I came back to Ottawa from Toronto, I was pleasantly surprised at how more diverse Ottawa was than it was when I was growing up. But I was taken aback by how homogeneous cities' institutions are. And I'm not just talking about media, I'm talking about political institutions, I'm talking about organizations, charities, etc. And so I have felt that that's a conversation that does have to happen, and that's why I do the kinds of stories I do. But I'm in the minority in my newsroom and in my profession. A lot of people are just so focused on being storytellers or on doing what they have to do to figure out how to fix the model. The newspaper model is broken. We have to fix it. How do we reach readers, etc. There is definitely a sort of, how do I put it, a school of thought in a lot of journalism that just like other fields. The myth of the meritocracy, for example, that is at play. That if these are stories that people want to read, they'll just kind of magically read them without an understanding that actually, in certain situations, you have to go out and make it possible for them to happen. I can't speak for the editorial board. They're a completely separate entity from the newsroom. Well, they're part of the newsroom, but there's a wall there, and they might very well look to Muslim Link, but it's a question of, is it on their radar? And your point about students coming in is a very good one. I think a lot of it's starting to change, and there's some really interesting programs like Shelby's involved with one that is doing its best to increase the diversity of media in Canada. But every year I look and I see who's coming in from the interns, who have we got, and it's there are occasionally someone who is not white, and but usually it's still very homogeneous. And what we find is that there aren't a lot of, for example, I am desperate for the first Somali intern to come into the newsroom, and it just hasn't happened.
Hint, Sarah.
And unfortunately, when you're a trailblazer, you have to work harder, and you have to knock those doors down, kick them open. If it's not on people's radar, you put yourself on the radar. But so my answer, I'm kind of wandering everywhere, but it is a problem. I don't think it is widely recognized as a problem within media organizations, and I think that unfortunately that means it ends up being incumbent on people to engage with those media organizations and point out to them it's a problem. Actually, I'll tell you one little story. I have a lot of friends, particularly in the Somali community, who call me very angry at certain stories, and I say, well, fine. I can say all I want to my bosses, not about my stories, my colleagues' stories. I can say all I want to my editors. They're used to hearing it from me. Get a delegation together and very politely, without anger, ask to speak to them and explain to them a bit about this story. Not to chastise and to berate, because that's not going to go anywhere. Just like the preaching to the youth is not going to go anywhere. And come in. And they haven't been able to do it yet. For whatever reason, they haven't taken me up on that suggestion. They've come very close. But that is a huge thing. If our editors don't hear from community members, they assume everything is okay until you point out to them how not okay it is. And in a way that's engagement as big as their blunder, as our blunders may be, to hear it in a constructive engagement way is going to go a lot further, even if you feel it deserves a strong measure of anger.